Reading through the Bible, chapter 38, Judha and Tamar. At that time, Judha left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judha met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judha got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judha said to Onan, "Lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law, to produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled the seed on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Now, what is going on here is inheritance. According to the Levirate marriage, if a man married and died without having children, then his brother was to marry the wife, and the son that is born from that union is to be legally the son of the firstborn. And so he then will get the inheritance from the father that has died. Onan doesn't want to do this, because if he does this, he will get only 1/4 of the inheritance. Will get a half, and Onan and Shelah get 1/4 each. So God puts him to death. Well, that leaves Shelah, but it looks like Shelah is not fully grown. And so we read on with verse 11, Judha then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judha had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judha saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" "Your seal and its cord, and your staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judha sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judha and said, "I didn't find her." Besides, the men who lived there said, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judha said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judha was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judha said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judha recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez, which means breaking out. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah, which means scarlet or brightness. We see here that Tamar was supposed to have been given to Shelah. She wasn't. And so she takes the matter into her own hands, disguises herself as a prostitute, has relations with Judha. And then when she is revealed that she is pregnant, she is to be brought out and burned to death. But notice that the same thing happens that happened to the robe of Joseph. It was shown to Jacob, and he was asked to recognize it. The same thing is done by Tamar. She tells Judha to recognize it. So Judha realizes that what she has done is more righteous than he had done by withholding Shelah from her as a husband. And there are 2 sons born to her, and both of these are going to have a place in the history later on.